In 410 AD, slaves ran through the streets of Rome screaming that the world was ending. They were right. For 3 days, Gothic warriors looted the Eternal City. They melted down golden statues that had stood for centuries. They dragged senators' wives from their beds. They burned libraries containing the last copies of ancient works we'll never read. The unthinkable had happened. Rome was falling. But here's what gets buried in history books. 70 years earlier, Rome controlled 2 million square miles. 1 in 4 humans alive bowed to the emperor. The empire stretched from Scotland to Iraq, from Morocco to the Black Sea. It was the largest empire the world had ever seen. Roman citizens didn't worry about collapse. They worried about which theatre to visit, which wines to import from Gaul, which slaves knew the best recipes for roasted peacock. They had central heating, running water, mail delivery, street lighting, welfare systems, fire departments. Some Roman houses had better plumbing than most cities would have for the next 1,000 years. So how did it all disappear? How does an empire that took a millennium to build collapse in a single human lifetime? How do you go from ruling the world to having your capital burned by people you called barbarians? The answer changes everything you think you know about power. Because Rome didn't fall from invasion. It fell from success. Every strength, pushed too far, became a weakness. Every victory contained the seeds of future defeat. We're about to walk through an empire's suicide. But to understand how Rome died, we need to understand how it lived, how a collection of outcasts on 7 hills became masters of the known world, how they built a civilization so advanced that when it fell, humanity wouldn't match it again for 1,000 years. This is that story. 7 hills rise from a swamp. The year is 753 BC. A group of shepherds and outcasts gather on the tallest hill, the Palatine. They've come here for one reason: to hide. These weren't noble founders. They were criminals, runaway slaves, debtors fleeing their creditors, the dregs of Italy. Their leader, a man named Romulus, had just murdered his twin brother over where to build their settlement. Blood soaked the foundation stones of what would become the Roman Forum. This was Rome's DNA: violence, ambition, and a willingness to absorb anyone useful. The early Romans had a problem, though. They were surrounded by older, richer, more sophisticated civilizations. To the north, the Etruscans built cities with sewers and temples, while Romans lived in mud huts. To the south, Greek colonies controlled the best farmland and trade routes. Everyone looked at these Roman hill dwellers the way Manhattan looks at New Jersey, with barely concealed contempt. But Romans had something their neighbors didn't. They had hunger, not just for food, though they had that too. Hunger for respect, hunger for security, hunger to matter. When you start at the bottom, you'll do things comfortable people won't. The first thing they did was steal their wives. The Romans invited their neighbors, the Sabines, to a religious festival. While the Sabine men watched the ceremonies, Roman men grabbed the unmarried women and dragged them back to their huts. The rape of the Sabine women wasn't just a founding myth. It was a mission statement. Rome would take what it needed. When the Sabine men came for revenge, something unexpected happened. The kidnapped women threw themselves between the 2 armies. They begged their fathers and new husbands to stop fighting. Some already had Roman babies at their breasts. The 2 peoples merged instead of destroying each other. This became Rome's pattern: conquer, then absorb, fight, then invite the enemy to become Roman. It was genius, really. Every victory made them stronger, not just bigger. The story of early Rome is shrouded in myth, but the myths tell us how Romans saw themselves. Cincinnatus, called from his plough to become dictator, saving Rome, then returning to his farm 16 days later. Mutius Scaevola, thrusting his hand into fire to show Etruscan kings that Romans felt no pain. Horatius, holding a bridge alone against an entire army. These weren't just stories. They were instruction manuals. This is how a Roman behaves. This is what we expect from you. Duty before comfort, state before self, death before dishonor. For 2.5 centuries, Rome stayed a monarchy. 7 kings ruled from that muddy hill. The early kings were decent enough. Numa gave them religion, Ancus Marcius gave them their first bridge across the Tiber, Servius Tullius gave them their first census. But the last king, Tarquin the Proud, made a fatal error. His son raped a noblewoman named Lucretia. She told her family what happened, then stabbed herself in the heart. Her blood sparked a revolution. Lucius Junius Brutus, who'd been playing the fool to survive Tarquin's paranoia, threw off his mask. He held up the bloody knife Lucretia had used and swore an oath. "By this blood, most pure before the outrage of a prince, I swear, and you, O gods, I call to witness that I will drive out King Tarquin, his cursed wife, and all his children, and never again will I let them or any other man be king in Rome." In 509 BC, the Romans drove out their king and swore that sacred oath. Never again would one man rule Rome. They created something radical, a republic. Power would be shared, temporary, accountable. 2 consuls instead of 1 king, a senate to advise them, assemblies where citizens could vote. It sounds noble. It wasn't. The republic was an oligarchy dressed in democratic clothes. Only the rich could hold high office. You literally had to serve for free. The Senate was a club for aristocrats who traced their bloodlines back to Romulus. Regular Romans, the plebeians, could vote but not rule. This should have torn Rome apart. Instead, it made them unstoppable. Because the patricians and plebeians needed each other. The rich needed the poor to fight their wars. The poor needed the rich to organize those wars. They fought constantly, but internally, through law, through politics, through compromise. When plebeians threatened to leave Rome entirely in 494 BC, literally to walk away and found their own city, the patricians caved. They created new offices called tribunes who could veto any law that hurt common people. When patricians hoarded too much land, new laws forced them to share. Every internal crisis led to reform, not revolution. This messy, argumentative system had a hidden superpower. It selected for competence. In monarchies, incompetent kings ruled until they died. In Rome, incompetent consuls got voted out after a year. In aristocracies, noble blood guaranteed power. In Rome, you had to prove yourself in court, in war, in public debate. The system was rigged for the rich, yes, but it was rigged for the competent rich. This mattered when the Gauls came. In 390 BC, a horde of Celtic warriors swept down from the Alps. They were bigger than Romans, better armed. They'd conquered everything in their path. At the Battle of Alea, 11 miles from Rome, they destroyed the Roman army so completely that July 18th became a cursed date Romans wouldn't conduct business on for centuries. The Gauls marched on Rome itself. They found it nearly abandoned. Everyone had fled except the senators, who sat in their chairs wearing their finest robes, waiting to die with dignity. The Gauls burned everything. Only a small garrison on Capitoline Hill held out. Legend says sacred geese warned them of a night attack, but legends lie. The truth was simpler. The Romans paid the Gauls to leave. 1,000 pounds of gold. When Romans complained the scales were rigged, the Gallic chief Brennus threw his sword on them too, saying, "Vae victis," woe to the conquered. Romans never forgot that humiliation, never forgot the smell of their burning city, never forgot begging barbarians for mercy. They rebuilt Rome with walls 30 feet high and 12 feet thick. They reorganized their army, abandoning Greek-style phalanxes for flexible manipular formations that could fight on any terrain. They created the most disciplined military machine the world had ever seen. But the real change was psychological. Before the Gallic sack, Romans fought for glory and loot. After it, they fought for survival. Every neighbor was a potential threat. Every border needed a buffer. Every buffer needed its own buffer. Security through dominance became the Roman way. They conquered the Latins first, their closest cousins, people who spoke the same language and worshipped the same gods. The Latin War of 340 to 338 BC should have been a family dispute. Instead, Rome crushed them completely, then did something unprecedented. They made them partners. Then came the Samnites in the mountains, 3 brutal wars across 50 years. The Samnites were tough mountain fighters who knew their terrain perfectly. At the Caudine Forks in 321 BC, they trapped an entire Roman army in a mountain pass, made them pass under the yoke, a humiliation Romans considered worse than death. But Romans learned from every defeat. They built roads through the mountains, the Via Appia, arrow straight for 300 miles. They developed new tactics for mountain warfare. They came back stronger every time they lost. The Etruscans to the north fell next. These were the people who'd taught Rome civilization, writing, engineering, religion. Students conquered their teachers. The Greeks to the south followed. Pyrrhus of Epirus came to help them with war elephants, beasts Romans had never seen. Pyrrhus won every battle but lost so many men that he said, "Another victory like this, and I'll return to Epirus alone." Hence our phrase, Pyrrhic victory. Romans just kept recruiting more soldiers and coming back. What made Rome different wasn't that they won, it was what they did after winning. When Alexander the Great conquered, he created subjects. When Persians conquered, they demanded tribute. When Rome conquered, they created Romans. Defeated enemies got different deals based on how hard they'd fought and how useful they'd be. Some became full citizens with voting rights. Some got Latin rights. They could trade and marry Romans but not vote. Some stayed independent but had to provide troops when Rome called. The genius was, everyone had a path to becoming more Roman. Serve in our armies and your children might become citizens. Stay loyal during a crisis and your whole city might get upgraded. This wasn't kindness, it was calculation. A subject who hopes to become Roman fights harder than a slave who knows he'll always be one. By 275 BC, Rome controlled all of Italy south of the Po River, 500,000 citizens, 3 million allies, an army that could field 700,000 men, more than any empire in the Mediterranean. They should have stopped there. A wise people would have consolidated, built prosperity, enjoyed peace. But Rome wasn't wise. Rome was hungry. And across the sea, another hungry power was watching. Carthage controlled the western Mediterranean, Spain, North Africa, Sicily, Sardinia, Corsica. They had the best navy in the world, the most gold, the most sophisticated trade networks. They looked at these upstart Romans the way a wolf looks at another wolf. There wasn't enough room for both. The war started over nothing. A group of Italian mercenaries called the Mamertines seized Messana, a Sicilian city, in 264 BC. Carthage sent troops to restore order. They couldn't have chaos so close to their territory. The mercenaries appealed to Rome for protection. Any sensible Roman would have said no. Sicily was Carthaginian territory. Rome had no navy, no experience fighting overseas. The Senate actually voted against intervening. But the popular assembly, full of young men hungry for glory and loot, overruled them. Democracy's first gift to Rome was the First Punic War. Romans didn't even have words for naval warfare. They called ships sailing horses. Their first fleet was built by copying a Carthaginian warship that washed up on their shore. Roman shipwrights numbered each plank so they could replicate it exactly. They trained rowers on dry land, men sitting on benches, swinging oars at empty air while officers called out rhythm. Carthaginians laughed when they heard about it. The laughter stopped when Romans invented the corvus, the raven. It was a boarding bridge with a metal spike that slammed into enemy decks, locking ships together. Carthaginians had spent centuries perfecting naval combat, ramming, maneuvering, using wind and current. Romans turned naval battles into land battles that happened to be on water. Instead of sophisticated seamanship, Roman soldiers simply walked across and did what they did best: kill everyone in close combat. At the Battle of Mylae in 260 BC, Rome's rookie navy destroyed the most experienced fleet in the world. But winning at sea wasn't enough. Rome decided to invade Africa itself, to burn Carthage like the Gauls had burned Rome. It was a disaster. The consul Marcus Regulus landed with 40,000 men and won initial victories. He offered Carthage terms so harsh they chose destruction over surrender. They hired a Spartan mercenary named Xanthippus, who knew how to fight Romans. At the Battle of Tunis, Carthaginian elephants and cavalry annihilated the Roman army. Regulus was captured, later sent back to Rome to negotiate peace. Legend says he advised the Senate to keep fighting, then returned to Carthage knowing he'd be tortured to death. They put him in a barrel lined with spikes and rolled it through the streets. Whether true or propaganda, Romans believed it. Another reason to hate Carthage. Then nature joined the war. The rescue fleet, 464 ships and 100,000 men, hit a storm off Sicily. Roman bodies washed up on beaches for weeks. It remains one of the deadliest maritime disasters in human history. Any other nation would have made peace. Rome built another fleet. That one sank too. 150 ships lost in another storm. Rome built another fleet. For 23 years, Rome threw men and gold into the sea. The human cost was staggering, perhaps 300,000 dead. The financial cost broke the treasury. Rich Romans had to fund the final fleet from their own pockets. But Rome had one advantage. Carthage didn't. They didn't know how to quit. Carthage was a business empire. When wars became too expensive, they made peace. Rome was an ideology. They fought until they won or died. In 241 BC, at the Aegates Islands, Rome's last fleet caught Carthage's last fleet trying to resupply Sicily. The Romans had learned seamanship the hard way, 20 years of disasters teaching what no manual could. They won decisively. Carthage, exhausted and bankrupt, surrendered. They gave up Sicily, paid massive reparations, agreed to Roman terms. Then Rome did something that showed their true nature. They broke the peace treaty immediately. While Carthage was weakened by a mercenary revolt, unpaid soldiers seizing cities, Rome seized Sardinia and Corsica. When Carthage protested, Rome threatened war. Carthage backed down and paid more gold. In Carthage, a young general watched this extortion and burned with rage. His name was Hamilcar Barca. He'd never lost a battle to Rome, but politicians had surrendered anyway. He made his 9-year-old son swear an oath on the altar of Baal, eternal hatred of Rome. The boy's name was Hannibal. Hamilcar took his son to Spain, where Carthage was building a new empire to replace what Rome had stolen. For 20 years they conquered Spanish tribes, mined silver, trained armies. Hamilcar died in battle, drowning while covering his son's retreat. His son-in-law Hasdrubal took over, then was assassinated. In 221 BC, the army chose their new leader, Hannibal, now 26 years old. He was everything Rome feared. Brilliant, could speak half a dozen languages, quoted Greek philosophy, understood logistics like a Roman, charismatic, slept on the ground with his soldiers, ate the same food, took the same risks, utterly ruthless. That childhood oath still burning in his heart. His men would have followed him into hell. They basically did. In 218 BC, Hannibal did the impossible. He marched 50,000 infantry, 9,000 cavalry, and 37 elephants across the Alps into Italy. Not through the coastal route Romans guarded, but through mountain passes no army had ever used. Half his army died in those mountains. Men fell into crevasses invisible under snow, froze to death in their sleep, starved when mountain tribes burned their supplies, were killed by rock slides the locals triggered. Elephants went mad with cold and had to be killed. Hannibal pressed on. When he descended into the Po Valley, Roman commanders couldn't believe it. An enemy army in Italy? Impossible. No foreign army had threatened Italian soil since the Gauls, 3 generations ago. Rome sent their armies to stop him. At the Trebia River in December 218 BC, Hannibal made the Romans ford icy water at dawn, then slaughtered them while they shivered. 20,000 Romans died. At Lake Trasimene, in 217 BC, he ambushed an entire army in morning fog. The consul Flaminius marched into a valley with the lake on one side, hills on the other. Hannibal's men were hidden in the hills, waiting. 15,000 Romans died in 3 hours, so many that a nearby stream ran red with blood for days. Rome panicked. They appointed a dictator, Fabius Maximus, who understood something crucial. You don't beat Hannibal in battle, you outlast him. Fabius refused to fight Hannibal directly. He shadowed the Carthaginian army, burned crops before they could harvest them, killed foragers, avoided battle. Romans called him Cunctator, the delayer. It wasn't a compliment. Roman culture despised caution. Young aristocrats needed military glory to advance their careers. The Senate wanted decisive action. The people wanted their tormentor destroyed. In 216 BC, they raised the largest army in Roman history, 80,000 men, and sent it to crush Hannibal at Cannae. What happened next was the most perfect tactical execution in military history. Hannibal had 40,000 men, half the Roman force. He placed his weakest troops in the center, Gauls and Spaniards who'd joined him. His strongest troops, African infantry, he placed on the flanks, his cavalry on the wings. When Romans attacked, his center bent backward like a bow. Romans pushed forward, thinking they were winning. More and more Romans poured into the center, compressing their own formation. Then the trap closed. The Carthaginian flanks wheeled inward. The cavalry, having destroyed Rome's horsemen, circled behind. The Roman army was surrounded, compressed, unable to use their weapons. Men in the center couldn't even lift their arms. They became cattle in a slaughterhouse. By sunset, 70,000 Romans were dead. Hannibal's men collected 3 bushels of gold rings from dead Roman aristocrats. They sent them to Carthage in baskets as proof of victory. 1 in 5 Roman men of military age died in a single afternoon. Rome's allies started defecting. Capua, the second largest city in Italy, joined Hannibal. Syracuse in Sicily revolted. Philip V of Macedon declared war. The empire was collapsing. Any other nation would have negotiated. When Hannibal sent an embassy to discuss peace, the Senate wouldn't even let them enter the city. Instead, Rome did something unprecedented. They freed slaves to fight, lowered the recruitment age to 16, drafted criminals from prisons. They refused to ransom prisoners, telling their families the men should have died fighting. The message was clear. Rome would accept death before defeat. They went back to Fabius's strategy, but executed it with brutal efficiency. Cities that joined Hannibal were besieged and destroyed. Capua's leaders were beheaded, their families sold into slavery. Syracuse was sacked so thoroughly that the mathematician Archimedes was killed by a Roman soldier who didn't know who he was. "Don't disturb my circles," were supposedly his last words as he worked on a geometry problem. Meanwhile, a young Roman general named Scipio took the war to Spain. His father and uncle had died there fighting Hannibal's brothers. Scipio was 25, technically too young for command, but he had something special. He could think like Hannibal. While Hannibal was stuck in Italy, slowly bleeding support, Scipio conquered Carthage's Spanish Empire, took New Carthage in a single day with an assault at low tide, cut off their silver mines, destroyed their reinforcements. Then Scipio did what Hannibal had done, the unexpected. He invaded Africa. Carthage recalled Hannibal after 15 years in Italy. He'd never lost a major battle, but he'd lost the war. Without reinforcements, without support from Carthage's merchant elite, he couldn't finish what he'd started. The 2 greatest generals of the age met at Zama in 202 BC. They actually talked before the battle. Hannibal proposing terms, Scipio refusing. This time, Scipio had learned Hannibal's tricks. He let the war elephants charge through gaps in his lines, used cavalry to destroy Hannibal's horsemen, surrounded the master of encirclement. Hannibal fled. Carthage surrendered. Rome's terms were merciless. Carthage gave up Spain. Their navy burned in the harbor while Carthaginians watched and wept. Their right to wage war without Roman permission. They paid reparations for 50 years. But Rome wasn't done. For 50 years, Carthage followed every treaty obligation, rebuilt through trade, paid their reparations early. Their recovery terrified Rome. An old senator named Cato visited Carthage and saw prosperous markets, busy harbors, growing wealth. He returned to Rome with a Carthaginian fig, fresh and ripe. "This grew in Carthage," he said. "The enemy is only 3 days away." From then on, Cato ended every speech, whether about road construction or grain distribution, with the same phrase: Carthage must be destroyed. In 149 BC, Rome demanded Carthage hand over all weapons and move their entire city 10 miles inland. It was a death sentence. Carthage lived by sea trade. Carthage chose to fight. For 3 years, they held out against Roman siege. Women cut their hair to make bowstrings. Temples were melted down for weapons. They freed slaves and promised them citizenship. When Rome finally broke through in 146 BC, they fought house by house for 6 days. The last defenders barricaded themselves in the Temple of Eshmun. The wife of the Carthaginian commander appeared on the roof with her children. She cursed her husband for surrendering, then threw her children into the flames and jumped after them. Rather than surrender, the last defenders set the temple on fire and burned alive. Rome sold 50,000 survivors into slavery. They destroyed every building, sowed the fields with salt so nothing would grow, cursed anyone who tried to rebuild. Carthage wasn't defeated. It was erased. The same year, Rome destroyed Corinth in Greece. The Achaean League had dared to assert independence. Roman general Mummius killed every male, enslaved every woman and child, burned the city so thoroughly that bronze statues melted into puddles. They were making a point. Resistance meant annihilation. The Mediterranean world got the message. By 133 BC, Rome controlled everything from Spain to Turkey. They called the Mediterranean Mare Nostrum, our sea. But something had broken inside Rome during those wars. The small farmers who'd formed the backbone of Roman armies were gone, dead at Cannae or fighting overseas for decades. Their farms were bought by the rich and worked by slaves from conquered territories. Wealth poured into Rome, gold from Spain, grain from Africa, slaves from everywhere. But it concentrated in fewer hands. The rich got richer, the poor got poorer. Veterans returned from conquering the world to find themselves homeless in the city they'd fought for. The Republic had conquered the Mediterranean, but lost its soul. And in that spiritual vacuum, monsters would grow. Tiberius Gracchus stood before the Roman assembly in 133 BC and asked a simple question. The wild beasts of Italy have their dens, but the men who fight and die for Italy have nothing but air and light. He was patrician nobility, grandson of Scipio Africanus, the man who'd beaten Hannibal. His father had conquered Spain. His sister married Scipio Aemilianus, destroyer of Carthage. He should have been defending the establishment, but he'd seen something on his way home from war in Spain. Empty farms, foreign slaves working Italian land, Roman veterans begging in streets. The law said no citizen could own more than 300 acres of public land. The rich owned thousands. Tiberius proposed enforcing the law, redistributing stolen land to landless veterans. The Senate went insane. Not because the proposal was radical, it was literally existing law, but because a tribune was challenging their power, making proposals directly to the people, bypassing senatorial authority. They convinced another tribune, Marcus Octavius, to veto the bill. Tiberius did the unthinkable. He had Octavius voted out of office. A tribune who acts against the people's interests, he argued, is no tribune at all. Then he passed his land reform. When the Senate refused to fund the land commission, Tiberius used his connections. The king of Pergamum had just died, leaving his kingdom to Rome. Tiberius proposed using that wealth for his reforms. The Senate saw revolution, a tribune conducting foreign policy, controlling finances. On election day, 133 BC, as Tiberius ran for a second term as tribune, illegal but not unprecedented, senators claimed he wanted to be king. The Pontifex Maximus, Scipio Nasica, Rome's chief priest and Tiberius's own cousin, wrapped his toga around his head in the ritual manner and declared a state of emergency. He led a mob of senators and their clients to the forum. They beat Tiberius Gracchus to death with chair legs and clubs. Then they threw his body in the Tiber like a criminal. 300 of his supporters were strangled without trial. For the first time in the Republic's history, Romans had killed Romans in political violence. Blood, once spilled, has a way of demanding more blood. 10 years later, Tiberius's younger brother Gaius became tribune. He was smarter, angrier, more dangerous. He didn't just want land reform, he wanted revolution. Gaius was a brilliant orator. Where Tiberius had been earnest, Gaius was magnetic. He paced the rostrum as he spoke, pulling his toga off his shoulder in passion. He was the first Roman politician to face the Forum while speaking, not the Senate House. Symbolic but powerful. Gaius introduced grain subsidies. The state would sell cheap wheat to the urban poor. He created public works projects, built roads, established colonies for veterans, extended citizenship rights to Italian allies, put equestrians, wealthy non-nobles, on extortion court juries, breaking the Senate's judicial monopoly. Every reform weakened the Senate and strengthened the people. Every benefit created voters loyal to Gaius, not the old aristocracy. In 121 BC, the consul Opimius convinced the Senate to pass the first Senatus Consultum Ultimum, the ultimate decree, basically martial law. The consul could do anything to save the state. Opimius attacked Gaius's supporters on the Aventine Hill. Gaius fled but was cornered in a sacred grove. He ordered his slave to kill him rather than be captured. His head was brought to Opimius, who'd promised its weight in gold. The man who brought it had filled the skull with lead to increase the reward. 3,000 of Gaius's followers were executed. The Senate thought they'd won. They'd crushed the populist threat, restored order. They'd actually signed their own death warrant. Because the Gracchi brothers had shown something crucial. The people were stronger than the Senate if someone could mobilize them. Violence worked better than votes. The Constitution was just words on paper if you had enough swords. The next generation learned these lessons well. In 107 BC, a man named Gaius Marius became consul. He was everything the aristocracy despised, a new man with no famous ancestors, son of a day laborer from Arpinum, married to Julius Caesar's aunt for her connections, not her bloodline. But Marius could fight. Rome was losing a war against Jugurtha in North Africa, a desert fox who'd learned Roman tactics as their ally. Worse, he'd bribed half the Senate. Roman commanders kept defeating him, then letting him escape for the right price. Marius promised real victory. The people elected him consul. Then Marius did something that changed everything. He recruited from the propertyless masses. Before, only landowners could serve. They had something to defend. Marius took anyone, promised them pay, loot, land when they retired. He created the first professional army, but these soldiers weren't loyal to Rome. They were loyal to Marius. He paid them. He led them to victory. He'd get them their retirement bonus. Marius crushed Jugurtha, though his deputy Sulla actually captured him through betrayal. Then German tribes invaded from the north, the Cimbri and Teutones. 300,000 warriors who'd destroyed every Roman army sent against them. At Arausio in 105 BC, they killed 80,000 Romans, worse than Cannae. The Senate had no choice but to keep re-electing Marius consul. 6 times total, completely illegal, completely necessary. Marius reformed the legions while waiting for the Germans, standardized equipment, created cohorts of 600 men, gave each legion an eagle standard, lose it, and the legion was disbanded in disgrace. Made soldiers carry their own gear. Marius's mules, they called themselves. At Aquae Sextiae in 102 BC, Marius killed 100,000 Germans. At Vercellae in 101 BC, he killed another 100,000. Rome was saved. But now Marius had the most dangerous thing in politics, a professional army personally loyal to him. His deputy during the German wars was Lucius Cornelius Sulla. Sulla was everything Marius wasn't, patrician aristocrat, descended from ancient nobility, beautiful in his youth, with piercing grey eyes and golden hair. He drank too much, slept with everyone, men, women, actors. But underneath the debauchery was genius, and underneath the genius was something cold. In 91 BC, Rome's Italian allies revolted. They'd fought Rome's wars for centuries but were still denied citizenship. They'd bled for Rome at Cannae, died for Rome in Spain, conquered for Rome in Greece. Their reward was taxation without representation. The social war, from socii, meaning allies, killed 300,000 people, more than Hannibal had killed. Italians knew Roman tactics, Roman discipline, Roman stubbornness. It was Rome fighting itself. Sulla won the crucial battles, brilliantly, ruthlessly. He became consul in 88 BC. got command of a lucrative war against Mithridates VI of Pontus, who'd just massacred 80,000 Roman citizens in Asia. Then the tribune Sulpicius passed a law transferring the command to old Marius. Sulla did the unthinkable. He marched his legions on Rome. For 450 years, armies stayed outside the sacred boundary, the Pomerium. It was the ultimate taboo. Sulla's own officers refused to follow except one, Lucullus. But the common soldiers didn't care about sacred boundaries. They cared about loot from Asia. Sulla took Rome in a day. Marius fled to Africa. Sulpicius was hunted down and killed, his head displayed on the rostra. Sulla declared Marius and his allies enemies of the state. Then he left for his war, assuming the matter was settled. The moment Sulla sailed east, Marius came back with his own army. The old general had gone mad, maybe from strokes, maybe from rage. He was 70 years old, had been hiding in African swamps, nearly died a dozen times. Survival had burned away everything but hatred. He killed everyone who'd supported Sulla. Heads of senators decorated the forum. Bodies clogged the Tiber. He freed slaves who'd kill their masters. Created a bodyguard of freed slaves called the Bardii, utterly loyal because their freedom depended on his survival. The consul Octavius was killed at the Temple of Jupiter, his head brought to Marius while he was eating dinner. Marius toasted it with wine. Marcus Antonius, the orator, grandfather of Mark Antony, tried to talk his way out of death. His eloquence moved even his killers to spare him. When Marius heard, he sent different killers. They brought back Antonius's head and hands. Marius died in 86 BC, 17 days into his 7th consulship, drinking himself to death, seeing ghosts, screaming at invisible enemies. But his faction held Rome. When Sulla returned in 83 BC with battle-hardened legions from Asia, civil war exploded. He landed at Brundisium with 40,000 men, veterans who'd followed him through Greece, Asia Minor, back through Greece again, who'd sacked Athens, looted the treasuries of Eastern kings, who were rich, loyal, and utterly devoted to their general. Young aristocrats flocked to Sulla's banner: Marcus Crassus, whose father had been killed by Marius; Gnaeus Pompey, only 23, who raised 3 legions from his father's veterans. Sulla called Pompey Imperator, commander, though he'd never held office. Also called him Teenage Butcher for his enthusiasm in killing enemies. The Marians had more men, but Sulla had better generals, and Sulla had something else: absolute ruthlessness. At the Colline Gate, November 82 BC, Sulla fought 100,000 Marians and Samnite allies literally at Rome's walls. The battle lasted through the night. Sulla's left wing broke. Enemy troops entered the city. Sulla threw himself into the breach, rallying his men by screaming he'd die as Imperator. By morning, 50,000 bodies littered the fields. Sulla had won. What followed was organized terror. Sulla gathered 6,000 Samnite prisoners in the Circus Maximus. While he addressed the Senate in the nearby Temple of Bellona, his men began killing the prisoners. The screams echoed through the temple. Senators went pale. Sulla continued speaking calmly, mentioning that some criminals were being punished. The message was clear: this is what I can do. Then came the prescription lists, names of enemies to be killed. Anyone could kill them, take their property. Lists started with 80 names, then 200, then 500. Eventually, 9,000 Romans were murdered. Sulla killed an entire generation of opposition. One senator was murdered for owning a nice villa Sulla's friend wanted, another for a fish pond. A man saw his own name on the list and said, "My Alban estate wants me dead." He was right, killed before he left the forum. The sons and grandsons of the proscribed were banned from public office, their property confiscated. 10,000 slaves of the proscribed were freed and given citizenship, as Cornelii, Sulla's family name, an instant political army loyal to their liberator. Sulla had himself declared dictator, but not the traditional 6-month emergency position. Dictator for life, for reforming the constitution. He reformed everything to make the Senate supreme, castrated the tribunate. Tribunes could no longer propose laws or hold further office, doubled the Senate's size, set minimum ages for offices, banned consecutive consulships, created permanent courts, reorganized provinces. Then, in 79 BC, he did something nobody expected. He retired. Simply walked into the forum, announced he was laying down his dictatorship, and offered to give an account of his actions to anyone who asked. Nobody dared. He walked through the forum without bodyguards, dared anyone to attack him, spent his last year writing memoirs and having orgies, died in bed in 78 BC, his body eaten by worms, possibly from chronic alcoholism. His funeral was the largest Rome had ever seen. His epitaph, which he wrote himself, read, "No friend ever did me so much good, or enemy so much harm, that I did not repay in full." Sulla thought he'd saved the Republic. He'd actually shown every ambitious man how to destroy it. Get an army, march on Rome, kill your enemies, make yourself dictator. The generation that survived Sulla's prescriptions learned this lesson perfectly. One was a young aristocrat whose uncle was Marius, and whose family was proscribed by Sulla. He had to hide in the countryside, moving every night. His wife's dowry was confiscated. Sulla's men demanded he divorce her. She was Cinna's daughter, Marius's ally. The young man refused. Sulla put him on the death list. Only intervention by the Vestal virgins and his mother's family saved his life. Sulla pardoned him reluctantly, saying, "In this young man I see many Mariuses." His name was Gaius Julius Caesar. Another survivor was Marcus Crassus, who'd made a fortune buying property from Sulla's victims. He created Rome's first fire brigade, which would only put out fires after buying the burning building cheap. The richest man in Rome. So wealthy he said no one could call themselves rich unless they could afford their own army. He could afford several. The third was Pompey, called Magnus, because he'd compared himself to Alexander the Great at 23. Brilliant general, terrible politician, desperate to be loved, which in Rome was a weakness. These three men would dance around each other for 20 years, sometimes allies, sometimes enemies, always dangerous. They'd grown up watching the Republic eat itself, learned that laws were suggestions, that armies were arguments, that Rome belonged to whoever was strong enough to take it. The Republic was already dead. It just didn't know it yet. In 73 BC, a gladiator named Spartacus killed his trainer with a kitchen knife. He wasn't supposed to be dangerous, just another Thracian slave, one of thousands who died for Roman entertainment. But Spartacus had been a soldier before his enslavement, maybe even a Roman auxiliary who'd deserted. He knew Roman tactics, Roman discipline. More importantly, he knew how to turn rabble into an army. 70 gladiators escaped with him from the school in Capua. They seized weapons from a wagon, fled to Mount Vesuvius. Within weeks, thousands of slaves had joined them. Within months, he commanded 100,000 escaped slaves. They destroyed every Roman force sent against them, made weapons from their chains, turned farm tools into spears, used Roman training against Roman armies. Rome panicked. This wasn't a foreign enemy. This was their economy rising up to kill them. 1/3 of Italy's population was enslaved. If they all revolted, if they united, the Senate gave command to Marcus Crassus. The richest man in Rome wanted something money couldn't buy: military glory. Pompey had it. Even young Caesar had won the civic crown for valor. Crassus had only his gold. He raised 6 new legions at his own expense. When one cohort fled from Spartacus, Crassus brought back decimation. The ancient punishment, 1 man in 10, chosen by lot, beaten to death by his comrades. His message was clear: fear me more than the enemy. Crassus trapped Spartacus in southern Italy, building a wall across the entire peninsula, 35 miles long, 15 feet high, a ditch 15 feet deep in front. But Spartacus broke through on a winter night, filling the ditch with trees and earth and bodies, lost 1/3 of his army doing it. The final battle came at the Salaris River in 71 BC. Spartacus knew he'd lose. He killed his own horse before the battle. He'd either capture Roman horses or no longer need one. Fought his way toward Crassus personally, trying to kill the Roman commander. Died within sight of him, still fighting despite 2 spear wounds. His body was never found. Crassus crucified 6,000 survivors along the Appian Way, one cross every 40 yards for 120 miles. From Capua to Rome, travelers walked between rotting corpses for months. The message was clear. This is what happens to slaves who dream of freedom. But Pompey stole Crassus's glory. Returning from Spain, he intercepted 5,000 fleeing slaves and claimed he'd ended the war. The Senate gave Pompey the triumph. Crassus got an ovation, the participation trophy of Roman honors. Crassus never forgot that humiliation. Meanwhile, Julius Caesar was climbing the political ladder with breathtaking speed. Not through military glory, he'd barely seen combat. Through charm, bribery, audacity. He borrowed massive sums from Crassus, threw the most spectacular games Rome had ever seen, gladiators with silver armor, feasts for entire districts, had affairs with everyone, men's wives, men themselves. Servilia, Brutus's mother, was his mistress for decades. Rumors said he'd slept with King Nicomedes of Bithynia in his youth. His soldiers later sang songs about him being every woman's man and every man's woman. When pirates captured Caesar near Rhodes, he laughed at their ransom demand. 20 talents! I'm worth at least 50. Spent 38 days with them, writing poetry, telling them he'd crucify them all. They thought he was joking. After his ransom was paid, he raised a fleet, captured them, and crucified every one. Though he did cut their throats first, he'd grown fond of them. That was Caesar, charming, cultured, utterly ruthless. In 60 BC, Caesar made a secret deal with Pompey and Crassus. Historians call it the First Triumvirate, but Romans just called it the three-headed monster. Pompey had armies but no political skill. Crassus had money but no respect. Caesar had ambition but no power. Together, they'd rule Rome. Caesar became consul in 59 BC and immediately broke every rule. His co-consul Bibulus tried to veto his legislation. Caesar's supporters dumped a basket of dung on Bibulus's head, broke his ceremonial rods. Bibulus retreated to his house and spent the rest of the year issuing proclamations that everything was illegal. Romans joked it wasn't the consulship of Caesar and Bibulus, but of Julius and Caesar. Caesar passed laws by force, redistributed land to Pompey's veterans, ratified Pompey's eastern settlements, reduced tax contracts for Crassus's friends, had a tribune who opposed him dragged from the forum, literally picked up and carried to prison. When the Senate followed in protest, Caesar said they could conduct business from jail. His reward was a 5-year command in Gaul. Not all of Gaul, just Cisalpine Gaul, northern Italy, and Transalpine Gaul, southern France. A backwater that bordered unconquered tribes, Caesar saw opportunity. Between 58 and 50 BC, Caesar conquered all of modern France and Belgium, crossed the Rhine into Germany, twice, invaded Britain, twice. It was genocide disguised as glory. His own accounts, the only surviving record, admit to killing 1 million Gauls and enslaving another 1 million. Real numbers were probably higher. Entire tribes were exterminated. Women and children sold in bulk to slave traders who followed his army. When the Helvetii tried to migrate peacefully through Roman territory, Caesar attacked, killed a quarter of their population, nearly 100,000 people, sent the survivors back to their homeland so Germans wouldn't settle it. When German tribes under Ariovistus crossed the Rhine for negotiations, Caesar arrested their leaders during the talks, then massacred their leaderless armies. Women killed their own children, then themselves, rather than become Roman slaves. The Gallic leader, Vercingetorix, united the tribes against Rome in 52 BC, a charismatic young noble who understood that Gauls had to fight like Romans to beat Romans. He nearly succeeded. At Gergovia, Caesar suffered his only major defeat in Gaul, lost 700 men, including 46 centurions, the backbone of his army, but Caesar turned defeat into strategic withdrawal. At Alesia, Vercingetorix made his stand. Caesar besieged him with 80,000 Gauls inside the fortress. Then a relief army of 250,000 Gauls besieged Caesar. Caesar built 2 walls, one facing in, one facing out. 25 miles of fortifications built in 3 weeks. When the Gauls attacked from both sides simultaneously, Caesar personally led the countercharge. his scarlet cloak visible across the battlefield. His men, seeing their general in danger, fought with desperate fury. The Gauls broke. Vercingetorix surrendered to save his people. Caesar kept him prisoner for 6 years, then strangled him during his triumph. Even Romans were horrified by Caesar's brutality. Cato demanded Caesar be handed over to the Germans for war crimes. But Caesar was sending back gold, mountains of it. So much that the price of gold in Rome dropped by a quarter, enough to bribe half of Rome. He paid off his debts, reportedly 300 million sesterces, bought senators, funded public buildings, made his legions rich, doubled their pay, gave bonuses after every campaign. More importantly, he created the most devoted army Rome had ever seen. Caesar knew every centurion's name. Promoted based on merit, not birth, his best legion, the 10th, was recruited from Spanish provincials, called his soldiers comrades, marched with them 30 miles a day on foot, ate with them, slept in the same conditions, nearly died with them multiple times, had his shield pierced by arrows, his sword broken in combat. They loved him for it, would march barefoot through winter for him, die for him, kill their own countrymen for him. While Caesar was conquering Gaul, Crassus grew jealous. He was 60, richer than ever, but Pompey and Caesar had glory. He decided to conquer Parthia, modern Iran, the only enemy Rome hadn't defeated, the only enemy that could match his wealth. Everyone told him not to go. Parthia hadn't attacked Rome. The omens were terrible. Sacred chickens wouldn't eat. A general's standard fell in the river. A tribune named Ateus actually cursed him as he left, performing ancient rituals of doom. At Carrhae in 53 BC, Crassus met the Parthian army in the desert. He had 40,000 men, 7 legions, the largest Roman army in the east. They had 10,000 horse archers. The Parthians never engaged, just rode in circles, shooting arrows, thousands of them, endless volleys. Camels brought fresh arrows, 1,000 camels, each carrying 100,000 arrows. Romans died under their shields, arrows finding every gap, pinning feet to ground, hands to shields. Crassus's son Publius led a charge to break out. The Parthians retreated, let him chase, then surrounded and annihilated his force. They put his head on a spear and paraded it in front of his father. The Roman army disintegrated, 20,000 dead, 10,000 captured and sent to guard Parthia's eastern frontier. They were never seen again. Crassus was killed at a fake peace negotiation. The Parthians poured molten gold down his throat, mocking his greed even in death, used his head as a prop in a performance of Euripides' The Bacchae. With Crassus dead, only Caesar and Pompey remained, 2 lions in a city built for one. They'd been family. Pompey married Caesar's daughter Julia. She was the one person both men truly loved, but she died in childbirth in 54 BC, along with the baby. The last bond between them snapped. Pompey allied with the Senate. They feared Caesar more than they hated Pompey, made him sole consul in 52 BC, essentially dictator, ordered Caesar to disband his armies and return for trial. Trial meant death. Caesar's enemies would convict him of something, anything, execute him. His decade of conquest would mean nothing. On January 10th, 49 BC, Caesar stood at the Rubicon River, the border between Gaul and Italy. To cross with an army was treason, civil war, the death of the Republic. Caesar spent the day arranging public works in Ravenna, attending a dinner party, acting normal while making the greatest decision in Roman history. At nightfall, he slipped away with a few companions, got lost in the dark, had to find a local guide, finally reached the river where his 13th Legion waited. He paused. Legend says a supernatural figure appeared playing a flute, then grabbed a trumpet and crossed the river. More likely, Caesar was calculating odds one last time. He turned to his officers and said in Greek, always the intellectual, "The die is cast." They crossed. Pompey fled to Greece, said he was regrouping, but everyone knew better. Caesar's veterans moved so fast they took towns before news of the invasion arrived. Caesar took Rome without fighting. He was so merciful that aristocrats complained. No prescriptions, no executions. He even pardoned men who'd fought against him. "I am not Sulla," he said. "I will show a new way." But first he needed money. He broke into the sacred treasury, the emergency fund never to be touched. When a tribune tried to stop him, Caesar said, "Stand aside. War recognizes no law." Caesar chased Pompey across the Mediterranean, first to Spain, where Pompey's lieutenants held 7 legions. Caesar defeated them in 6 weeks without a major battle. "I go to fight an army without a leader," he'd said, "than to fight a leader without an army." In Greece, things went badly at first. At Dyrrhachium, Pompey actually defeated Caesar, built fortifications that trapped Caesar's army. Caesar's men ate bark and roots, made bread from grass that they threw at Pompey's soldiers, saying, "We're not men, we're animals. We'll eat the earth itself before we surrender." Caesar lost 1,000 men trying to break out. Pompey could have ended the war there, but he was cautious. Let Caesar escape. Today, the enemy would have won, Caesar said, if they had a commander who knew how to conquer. At Pharsalus in 48 BC, they met for the last time. Pompey had 45,000 men to Caesar's 22,000. Better position, Senate's backing. His camp was so confident they were arguing about how to divide Caesar's property. But Caesar had veterans who'd conquered Gaul, and Caesar had Caesar. He told his men to aim for the faces of Pompey's cavalry, young aristocrats vain about their looks. It worked. They fled rather than be scarred. Caesar won decisively, then ordered his men to spare any Roman who asked for mercy. "They are not enemies," he said, "but fellow citizens, momentarily misguided." Pompey fled to Egypt, where the boy pharaoh Ptolemy XIII had him murdered on the beach. Thought it would please Caesar. His advisor gave Caesar Pompey's head and seal ring. Caesar wept when they brought him Pompey's head. Maybe genuine grief. They'd been friends once, family, maybe political theater. With Caesar, you never knew. He had Pompey's assassins executed, then stayed in Egypt for 9 months. Cleopatra had herself smuggled to him in a carpet, or maybe a laundry bag. Sources differ. She was 21, brilliant, spoke 9 languages. Caesar was 52 and enchanted. They became lovers immediately. He fought a war to make her queen, defeating her brother Ptolemy. Took a cruise down the Nile with her, 400 ships, showing Roman power to Egypt. She bore him a son, Caesarion, the only son he'd ever acknowledge, though he couldn't under Roman law. She was foreign. Caesar spent the next 3 years mopping up resistance. At Thapsus in Africa, Cato's forces were destroyed. Cato committed suicide rather than accept Caesar's mercy, spent his last night reading Plato's Phaedo twice, then stabbed himself. When servants tried to save him, he tore out his own intestines. "Now I am master of myself," were his last words. At Munda in Spain, Caesar faced Pompey's sons. The battle was so fierce, Caesar had to dismount and fight in the front line to prevent his veterans from breaking. "I have often fought for victory," he said afterward, "but today I fought for my life." After one 5-day campaign in Asia Minor, he sent the Senate a 3-word report. Veni, vidi, vici. I came, I saw, I conquered. By 45 BC, Caesar was master of Rome, dictator for life, an office created for him, wearing red boots like ancient kings, having his face on coins, something only done for gods. He reformed everything with manic energy. The calendar, creating the Julian calendar with 365 days and leap years. So accurate we essentially still use it. The year 46 BC had to be 445 days long to realign the seasons. Romans called it the Year of Confusion. Gave land to veterans, citizenship to Gauls who'd served him, planned libraries to rival Alexandria, new forums, draining marshes, a canal through the Isthmus of Corinth, wanted to conquer Parthia, avenge Crassus, then march through Scythia and Germany, returning through Gaul, conquer the entire world, rule for 20 years, establish a dynasty. The Senate saw a king. On February 15th, 44 BC, at the festival of Lupercalia, Mark Antony offered Caesar a crown 3 times. Caesar refused 3 times, but everyone saw him hesitate, saw him gauge the crowd's reaction, saw him want it. 60 senators formed a conspiracy. led by Marcus Brutus, descendant of the man who'd expelled the last king. Caesar loved Brutus like a son. Maybe he was his son. Caesar had been sleeping with Brutus's mother, Servilia, for decades. Gave her a pearl worth 6 million sesterces. The conspirators worked on Brutus's family pride, left notes on his ancestor's statue. Would that you were alive. On his praetor's chair, Brutus, are you asleep? The night before the Ides of March, Caesar dined with Marcus Lepidus. The conversation turned to death. What was the best kind? Caesar, working on correspondence while others talked, looked up and said, a sudden one. That night, his wife Calpurnia dreamed he was murdered, begged him not to go to the Senate. The omens were terrible. Sacrificial animals with no hearts, birds of prey circling. A soothsayer named Spurina had warned him about the Ides of March. Caesar nearly stayed home, but Decimus Brutus, another conspirator, convinced him the Senate would think him superstitious, cowardly, controlled by his wife. As Caesar passed Spurina on the way to the Senate, he joked, "The Ides have come." "Yes," replied the soothsayer, "but they have not passed." A Greek teacher named Artemidorus tried to hand him a letter naming the conspirators. Caesar took it, but didn't read it. Too many other petitions. On March 15th, 44 BC, Caesar entered the theatre of Pompey, the Senate's temporary meeting place while the Forum was being rebuilt. Ironic, killed in a building his enemy had constructed. Mark Antony, strong enough to defend Caesar, was detained outside by conspirators. One senator approached with a petition about his exiled brother. Others crowded around. Caesar tried to wave them away. This could wait. Then Tilius Cimber grabbed his toga. "This is violence," Caesar shouted. Casca struck first, his dagger glancing off Caesar's shoulder. Caesar grabbed the blade with his hand, shouting, "Casca, villain! What are you doing?" Then they all struck, 23 wounds. Caesar fought back until he saw Marcus Brutus among the assassins. Ancient sources differ on his last words. Some say nothing, some say in Greek, "You too, my son." Shakespeare would later immortalize it as "Et tu, brute." Caesar pulled his toga over his head. A Roman should die with dignity. Let them finish. Tried to arrange his clothing so he'd fall decently. He fell at the base of Pompey's statue, blood pooling around the feet of his old enemy. The last elected consul of the Roman Republic was dead. The conspirators thought they'd saved the Republic. Brutus raised his bloody dagger and shouted, "People of Rome, we are once again free." The senators fled in panic. Nobody cheered. They'd just guaranteed the Republic's final destruction. Because Caesar had an heir, his 18-year-old great-nephew, Gaius Octavius, sickly, bookish, no military experience. Nobody took him seriously. That was their last mistake. Octavian, as young Gaius Octavius now called himself, arrived in Rome 40 days after Caesar's murder. He was 18 years old, studying in Apollonia when the news reached him. His friends begged him to stay in Greece, take command of the Macedonian legions, march on Rome as a conqueror. Octavian chose a different path. He would conquer through law, not war, at least at first. Everyone underestimated him. Mark Antony, Caesar's lieutenant, laughed at this boy who owed everything to a name. The Senate thought they could use him against Antony. Cicero, Rome's greatest orator, said they should praise him, honor him, and discard him. They didn't understand what stood before them. Octavian was everything Caesar wasn't. Patient where Caesar was impulsive. Calculating where Caesar was passionate. Cold where Caesar was warm. Caesar conquered through charisma. Octavian conquered through terror and time. His first move was brilliant. Caesar's will had been read. Octavian was adopted as his son and heir. But it also left 75 denarii to every Roman citizen, 300 to every soldier. Mark Antony controlled Caesar's fortune and refused to pay. So Octavian borrowed against his future inheritance, sold his own property, paid Caesar's legacies from his own pocket, technically not even his yet. While Antony hoarded Caesar's gold, this 18-year-old boy honored Caesar's promises. The people loved him for it. Caesar's veterans flocked to his standard. He also stole Caesar's war chest. 700 million sesterces hidden in temples, claimed it was his by right of inheritance, used it to raise armies from Caesar's colonies. 2 legions defected from Antony just for a signing bonus. The Senate, thinking they were clever, legitimized Octavian's illegal army, gave him imperium, official command, made him a senator though he was 20 years too young. They needed someone to fight Antony, who'd gone north to besiege Decimus Brutus, one of Caesar's assassins, in Mutina. Octavian marched north with the consuls Hirtius and Pansa. They defeated Antony in 2 battles. Both consuls conveniently died. Hirtius in battle, Pansa of wounds. Rumors said Octavian had them poisoned. Now he commanded 8 legions. The Senate tried to dismiss him. Mission accomplished, boy, now go home. Octavian sent a delegation demanding the consulship. The Senate laughed. He was 19, 30 years too young. So Octavian marched on Rome, just like Sulla, just like Caesar. But when his soldiers met him outside the city, he pretended surprise. "You've come for your bonuses?" he asked innocently. "No," they replied. "We've come to make you consul." The Senate caved, made him consul at 19. His first act was to legalize his own adoption. His second was to try Caesar's assassins in absentia, all condemned to death. Then Octavian did something nobody expected. He made a deal with Antony. They met on a small island in a river near Bologna. Octavian, Antony, and Marcus Lepidus, Caesar's former master of horse. 3 men who hated each other, united by ambition. They formed the second triumvirate in November 43 BC. Unlike the first, this one was legal. The Senate, surrounded by their armies, voted to make them essentially 3 dictators for 5 years. They divided the world. Antony got Gaul, Lepidus Spain and Narbonese Gaul, Octavian Africa, Sicily, and Sardinia. The worst portions, but Octavian was junior partner. Then came the prescriptions. They sat for 3 days, trading names like playing cards. "You can kill my cousin if I can kill yours. Your brother for my uncle. 300 senators, 2,000 equities, anyone with money they needed." Octavian supposedly argued for clemency at first, then gave in completely. He wanted Cicero dead. The old man had mocked him once too often. Antony wanted him dead too. Cicero's Philippics had savaged him. Lepidus sacrificed his own brother. Cicero was first on the list. The great orator tried to flee to Greece, changed his mind several times, unusual for the decisive Cicero. Finally set sail, then turned back, unable to leave Italy. Was caught on December 7th, 43 BC, on a coastal road near Formiae. His slaves prepared to fight for him. Cicero ordered them to set down his litter. "There is nothing proper about what you do, soldier," he said to his killer, "but try to kill me properly." He stretched his neck out to make it easier. They cut off his head and hands, the hands that had written the Philippics. Antony had them nailed to the rostra in the Forum, the platform where Cicero had given his greatest speeches. Antony's wife, Fulvia, pulled out Cicero's tongue and stabbed it with hairpins, revenge for his eloquence. The triumvirs needed money for war against Caesar's assassins. Brutus and Cassius had fled east after the assassination, raised 19 legions, controlled the wealthy eastern provinces, had the moral high ground. They called themselves the Liberators. At Philippi in Macedonia, October 42 BC, the 2 armies met. The first battle was indecisive. Brutus defeated Octavian, who spent the battle sick in his tent. Maybe illness, maybe cowardice. His camp was captured. He hid in a marsh, but Antony crushed Cassius, who committed suicide not knowing Brutus had won. 20 days later, they fought again. Brutus's soldiers, demoralized and hungry, forced him to give battle. Antony won decisively. Brutus fled with 4 legions. That night, he quoted Greek tragedy to his friends. "O wretched virtue, you were but a name, and yet I worshipped you as real." He asked each companion to kill him. All refused. Finally, he held his sword while his servant Strato ran him through. "Now I am certain that you are happy, Caesar," were his last words. "Both because you are avenged and because you can welcome me." Antony gave Brutus an honorable burial. Octavian had the head cut off and sent to Rome to be thrown at Caesar's statue. It never arrived. lost in a storm at sea. The Republic died with Brutus at Philippi. The triumvirs divided the world again. Antony got the rich east, where the money was. Octavian got Rome and the west, where the problems were. Lepidus got Africa and irrelevance. Octavian had to settle 170,000 veterans, needed land, confiscated it from Italian cities that had supported the liberators. Entire populations displaced. The poet Virgil lost his farm, though Octavian later restored it. Italy burned with resentment. Meanwhile, Antony went east to raise money and met Cleopatra. She came to him at Tarsus in 41 BC like Aphrodite, sailed up the river in a golden barge with purple sails, silver oars keeping time to flute music. She lay under a golden canopy, dressed as Venus. Boys dressed as Cupids fanned her. Handmaidens dressed as sea nymphs steered the ship. Antony had summoned her to answer charges of helping Cassius. Instead, she summoned him to her ship for dinner. The second night, he tried to outdo her hospitality, failed miserably, made jokes about his own crudeness. She was 28, had already seduced Julius Caesar. Antony was 42, handsome, powerful, susceptible. He fell completely. Or maybe she fell. With Cleopatra, power and pleasure were inseparable. She needed Roman protection. He needed Egyptian gold. Together, they could rule the world. Antony spent the winter of 41 to 40 BC with her in Alexandria. They formed a drinking society called the Inimitable Livers. Dressed as common people and roamed the streets at night, played elaborate pranks. Once, while fishing, Antony had divers attach fish to his hook, so he'd always catch something. Cleopatra had her divers attach a salted fish, ancient and obviously preserved. "Leave fishing to us Egyptians," she said. "Your prey is cities and kingdoms." She bore him twins, Alexander Helios and Cleopatra Selene, the sun and moon. While Antony played in Egypt, Octavian faced crisis in Italy. Antony's wife Fulvia and his brother Lucius raised 8 legions against him. The Perusine War, fighting over veteran settlements. Octavian besieged them in Perusia, starved them into surrender. He executed the entire city council, 300 aristocrats, on the Ides of March, at an altar to Julius Caesar, human sacrifice to his adoptive father's ghost. Then Sextus Pompey, son of Pompey the Great, strangled Rome's grain supply, controlled the seas with his fleet, called himself son of Neptune, gave refuge to proscribed senators, runaway slaves. Rome starved. The triumvirs met at Brundisium in 40 BC to avoid civil war. Fulvia had conveniently died. Antony married Octavian's sister Octavia, beautiful, intelligent, virtuous, everything Cleopatra wasn't. The marriage sealed their alliance. They divided the world once more. Antony kept the east. Octavian got the west. Lepidus kept Africa. The dividing line was Scodra in Illyria. It took Octavian 6 years to defeat Sextus Pompey, lost entire fleets, nearly drowned in naval battles, finally found Marcus Agrippa, his childhood friend, brilliant admiral and engineer. Agrippa built a new fleet, created new tactics, invented the harpax, an improved grappling hook, defeated Sextus at Naulocus in 36 BC. Lepidus tried to assert himself, claiming Sicily. Octavian walked into his camp alone. No weapons, no guards. Lepidus's own soldiers defected on the spot. 22 legions switched sides without a fight. Octavian let Lepidus live, made him Pontifex Maximus, a religious position with no power, public humiliation worse than death. Now only 2 remained. While Octavian fought brutal wars in the west, Antony luxuriated in the east. His Parthian campaign of 36 BC was a disaster, lost 35,000 men, a quarter of his army, retreated through Armenia in winter. Men ate leather, roots, unknown herbs that drove them mad. He blamed Octavian for not sending promised troops. Octavian blamed him for not waiting. The cracks widened. Antony returned to Cleopatra, married her in 37 BC, though still married to Octavia under Roman law, had another son, Ptolemy Philadelphus. In 34 BC, he held the donations of Alexandria, sat on golden thrones with Cleopatra. He dressed as Dionysus. She, as Isis, gave away Roman territories to their children. Alexander Helios got Armenia and everything east. Cleopatra Selene got Cyrenaica and Libya. Ptolemy Philadelphus got Syria and Asia Minor. Caesarion, Caesar's son, was proclaimed King of Kings. Roman territories given to foreign children. It was treason. Octavian waged propaganda war, published Antony's will, allegedly. It confirmed the donations. Asked to be buried in Alexandria, not Rome. Romans were horrified. A Roman who wanted to be buried in Egypt? Who gave Roman lands to a foreign queen? Octavian didn't declare war on Antony. That would be civil war. He declared war on Cleopatra, made it Rome versus Egypt, West versus East, virtue versus decadence. The propaganda was masterful. Cleopatra would make Rome her slave, move the capital to Alexandria, make senators worship Egyptian gods. Every Roman fear crystallized in one foreign woman. At Actium, September 2nd, 31 BC, the fleets met. Antony had larger ships, 500 vessels, some with 10 banks of oars. Octavian had Agrippa, 400 lighter, faster ships. The battle was strangely anticlimactic. Antony's fleet was undermanned. Disease had killed his rowers. His allies were defecting daily. In the middle of the battle, Cleopatra's squadron of 60 ships fled. Antony followed her, abandoned his fleet, his army, his honor, transferred from his massive flagship to a faster vessel, and chased after her. His men surrendered immediately, couldn't believe their commander had abandoned them for a woman. Octavian pursued them to Egypt, took his time, 11 months, let them stew in their defeat, let their allies desert, let despair do his work for him. When he finally arrived in summer 30 BC, Antony's forces evaporated. His cavalry defected during the battle. His fleet surrendered without fighting. Antony heard falsely that Cleopatra was dead, fell on his sword, botched it. The blade went through his stomach, not his heart. Took hours to die. They carried him to Cleopatra's mausoleum, hauled him up through a window. She'd barricaded the doors. He died in her arms. Cleopatra tried to seduce Octavian, appeared before him beautifully dressed, surrounded by busts of Julius Caesar, showed him Caesar's letters to her. Octavian was immune to everything but power. She knew she'd be displayed in his triumph, paraded through Rome in chains, the last pharaoh as Roman trophy. On August 12th, 30 BC, she dressed in her royal robes, had a feast, then killed herself. Legend says with an asp, the sacred snake of Egyptian royalty. More likely poison, faster, more certain. She was 39, the last of the Ptolemies who'd ruled Egypt for 300 years. Octavian killed Caesarion. The boy was 17. Too many Caesars is not a good thing, Octavian said. He spared Antony and Cleopatra's children. They were no threat. Raised by his sister Octavia, Antony's widow. Roman mercy at its strangest. Egypt became Octavian's personal property, not a Roman province, his, the wealthiest territory on earth, paid grain and gold directly to him. No senator could even visit without his permission. At 32, Octavian ruled the entire Mediterranean, 50 legions, every province, no rivals, absolute power. The Republic was dead, but Octavian was too smart to call himself king. On January 13th, 27 BC, Octavian made a great show in the Senate. He was laying down his powers, he announced, returning authority to the Senate and people. The Republic was restored. It was theater. Everyone knew it. The Senate, terrified of another civil war, immediately begged him to stay, gave him a new name, Augustus, the revered one, gave him proconsular power over Spain, Gaul, Syria, and Egypt, where the armies were, for 10 years, renewable. He kept the forms of the Republic. Consuls still served, though Augustus recommended them. The Senate still met to approve his decisions. Courts still functioned under judges he appointed. He called himself princeps, first citizen, not king, not dictator, just first among equals. The lie was so elegant that everyone pretended to believe it. Augustus understood something crucial. Romans would accept a king as long as you didn't call him one. They'd bow to an emperor who pretended to be a citizen, give them the illusion of freedom, and they'd give you real power. He lived modestly, same small house on the Palatine for 40 years, wore homespun togas his wife made, ate simple food, bread, cheese, fish, figs, called everyone my good fellow, the common touch of an uncommon man. But behind the modest facade was iron control. He had lists of every senator, their property, their debts, their secrets, created the Praetorian Guard, 9,000 elite soldiers stationed in Italy, the only armed force allowed near Rome, his personal army. He slowly strangled the old institutions, made himself censor, controlled who could be senator. Pontifex Maximus controlled religion. Tribune made his person sacred. Any attack was sacrilege. Father of the country made opposition feel like betraying family. The genius was gradualism. No single reform seemed revolutionary. Each small step seemed reasonable. Until one day Romans woke up in an empire. Augustus ruled for 45 years, longer than any emperor after him. By the time he died, no one alive remembered the Republic. His system seemed natural, inevitable, as if it had always existed. He transformed Rome from brick to marble, built the Forum of Augustus, the Arapacis, restored 82 temples. I found Rome a city of bricks, he boasted, and left it a city of marble. Created professional police, the vigils, fire brigades, a permanent navy, the first courier system. Messages could cross the empire in weeks, standardized currency, laws, weights and measures. He pushed the borders to natural frontiers, the Rhine and Danube in Europe, the Sahara in Africa, the Euphrates in the east, conquered Egypt, made the Mediterranean a Roman lake. But he knew when to stop. In 9 AD, 3 legions under Varus were annihilated in Germany's Teutoburg forest. 20,000 men, eagle standards lost. Germanic tribes under Arminius, a Romanized German who'd learned Roman tactics, led them into swamps and slaughtered them. Augustus would bang his head against walls crying, "Varus, give me back my legions." He pulled back to the Rhine, never tried to conquer Germany again, told his successors to keep the empire within its current borders. His greatest achievement was peace, the Pax Romana, Roman peace. After a century of civil war, Romans could travel from Britain to Syria without fear. Trade exploded, cities flourished, population doubled. The Mediterranean world had never been so prosperous. But Augustus had one great failure: succession. He had one daughter, Julia, no sons. He married Julia to his nephew Marcellus. Marcellus died. He married her to his friend Agrippa. They had 5 children. Augustus adopted the boys. Agrippa died. He married Julia to his stepson Tiberius, forced Tiberius to divorce the woman he loved. Julia hated Tiberius, had legendary affairs. Augustus, who'd passed strict morality laws, had to exile his own daughter for adultery. His adopted sons died young, Lucius at 18, Gaius at 23, possibly poisoned by Livia, Augustus's wife, Tiberius's mother. The third grandson, Agrippa Posthumus, was brutish and violent. Augustus exiled him. Only Tiberius remained, a brilliant general who never wanted to be emperor. Augustus died on August 19th, 14 AD, at 76. His last words to his friends were, "Did I play my part well in this comedy of life?" When they applauded, he added the traditional ending of Roman comedies, "Then applaud as I exit." His last words to Livia were, "Live mindful of our marriage and farewell." He had played his part perfectly, transformed a republic into an empire while pretending to restore it, created a system that would last 400 years, the greatest political magic trick in history. But the play wasn't over. Tiberius never wanted to be emperor. When the Senate offered him power, he hesitated, called it miserable slavery. They had to beg him to accept. He was 56 years old, had conquered Germany, led armies from the Rhine to the Danube, but Augustus had broken him, forced him to divorce Vipsania, the woman he loved, marry Julia, who despised him. Once, he saw Vipsania in the street and followed her home, weeping. Augustus made sure they never met again. Tiberius tried to rule well at first, refused divine honors, told the Senate to speak freely. "Let them hate me," he said, "as long as they approve of what I do." But Romans didn't want a partner. They wanted a master. The Senate groveled, flattered, informed on each other. Once, when he left the Senate, Tiberius muttered in Greek, "Men fit to be slaves." He came to despise them, despise Rome, despise himself. In 27 AD, disgusted, Tiberius retreated to Capri, an island fortress off Naples, accessible only by one narrow path. He never returned to Rome, ruled the empire from an island villa for his last 11 years. Rumors spread about what he did there. Swimming pools full of children trained to nibble him underwater. He called them his little fish. Bedrooms decorated with pornographic paintings and sex manuals. Boys and girls dressed as pans and nymphs copulating in groves. Suetonius, writing decades later, catalogued every perversion. Probably lies, maybe not. Power corrupts in predictable ways. What's certain is that Tiberius ruled through Sejanus, Lucius alias Sejanus, prefect of the Praetorian Guard, son of a knight, ambitious, ruthless, patient. Sejanus concentrated the guard in Rome, built them a fortress, the Castra Praetoria, made them the real power. While Tiberius hid on Capri, Sejanus ran the empire. He seduced Livilla, Tiberius's daughter-in-law. Together they poisoned her husband Drusus, Tiberius's only son, made it look like illness. Tiberius never suspected, mourned his son, trusted Sejanus more. Sejanus used treason laws to eliminate rivals. The law of mightiest, any insult to the emperor was treason. Informers got a quarter of the victim's property. Accusations exploded. A man was executed for melting down a statue of Tiberius. Another for having Tiberius's image on a ring when entering a brothel. A woman for weeping at her son's funeral. Excessive grief implied criticism of